Welcome back, everybody. Deuce Hammer here, and I've got another build for you today. This is a Bleed Lightning Spear Tactician that I have been having a lot of fun on. So we've got T4 Xesht on farm. We're blowing up our T15-16 maps. So let's dive right into this. So you may be asking yourself, why the Tactician on a Lightning Spear Bleed build? Well, there are a couple reasons. Starting with suppressing fire, projectile damage builds pin, and right where we want them, pinned enemies cannot perform actions. Tie this to Combat Frenzy, where we're gaining a Frenzy charge for our pin, and pair this with Electrocute on Herald of Thunder, and we are generating endless amounts of Frenzy charges for our Lightning Spear. Now, if Lightning Spear is not outright deleting the entire screen and then some, everything that's left is either pinned, electrocuted, or both. We finish our Ascendancy out with the defensives, polish that gear, and stay light use cover, which I am finding to be very strong given our position in the tree with evasion and armor. Additionally, the Tactician has access to low life nodes, which we are leveraging with Deepest Tower, Spirit Bone, Crown. Put this all together and we have an extremely strong mapper, wave clear character who's able to take down the toughest bosses in the game with the bleed on the Rake and the Blood Hunt. Let's go over the gear. So right off the bat, you see this is a Tangle Tongue build. Now this will look very familiar to you if you watched my build video on my Ritualist. I essentially ported over the ideas and the tech from that Ritualist and plopped it right onto this Tactician. So the goal with Tangle Tongue on this build is to ensure that you are getting an effective chance for twice critical hit at 100% on your Blood Hunt. And then after that, you're essentially trying to scale your critical damage bonus as much as you possibly can. Here on the tooltip, I've got 520% currently. And then for Rake and Lightning Spear, your effective chance for twice critical hit is not going to be at the 100% mark. 56 right now on this character, which is a bit low, sometimes can result in having to go in for multiple rakes rather than getting the bleed that you want right off the bat on this character for a single target. But with Lightning Spear, based on our tree, currently sitting at 62% on twice critical hit. The twice critical hit coming from the fork critical hits modifier on the Tangle Tongue. We're using 2 Tangle Tongues, 2 weapon sets on this build because we are scaling elemental with Lightning Spear and also physical with Rake. And we'll get into the details of that split in the passive tree later. For Helm, we're using Deepest Tower, Spirit Bone, Crown. This brings a lot of damage for our close quarters, Rake, Blood Hunt, but even Lightning Spear when we're throwing that at enemies that are right in our face. What this does is it shrinks your presence area of effect, but makes it so that any enemies within your presence are considered low life. And we take advantage of that via Execute on Rake and also within our passive tree. The last required unique on this build is Beetle Bite Shoes. This will guarantee that you aggravate bleeding if you go in for a rake and then disengage. The great thing about this is it pairs nicely with Deepest Tower, Spirit Bone, Crown because your presence is actually shrunk, which allows you to more easily aggravate bleeding when you re-enter and the enemy becomes in your presence again and they already have a bleed on. For these boots, 30% is the maximum roll, so getting a roll close to 30 is really nice. And then a double rune slot corruption with Rune of the Chase can help bring your movement speed up with these Beetle Bite boots. Then optionally, I am using a Warrior Invictus Grand Regalia. I find that for the Tactician, where we're at in the tree, scaling our evasion, armor, adding some energy shield, and also the versatility of the socket filled modifiers really brings a lot of defense to the build. In this case, we've got a very good roll on the armor, evasion, and energy shield, but then we've got the chaos resistance, elemental resistance, and stun threshold. I find stun threshold to be very good in this environment in Dawn of the Hunt where light stunning can become somewhat of an issue. Pair that with some of the nodes within the Tactician Ascendancy, and we hardly ever get stunned. Now, if you don't go with the Grand Regalia, I would look for an armor evasion split chest piece. You don't want to go all evasion on this character because of Stay Light, Use Cover, which caps evasion at 50%. Then for the rares, shields are extremely important for this build. One, because of that evasion cap, we definitely want to supplement that with our block chance. And then two, we get into lay siege and offensive stance, so we are getting a massive damage increase based on our chance to block. So for me, I went with the tower shields and the triple res. Now, you're either going to need to bring a lot of res or mix in some attributes on your shield. Attributes are very stretched thin on this build, so you definitely need to get strength, intel, and dex on some of your pieces. But the most important stat for the shield is increased block chance and trying to get over 40% on that block chance. And then maximum life is really beneficial on all of the gear that you can put it on. For gloves, the flat damage to physical and then an elemental is very beneficial. And then +2 level to skills, you can go melee or projectile. And then having either dex or strength and then a resistance really helps to fill some gaps with your gloves. And we've got the Rune of Cruelty in here for a total of 30% increased magnitude because of the corruption that we got for the double rune slot. It's not absolutely required, but it is very nice. Then the belt, maximum life is big, and then you're just trying to fill gaps with attributes and resistances. For rings, this breach ring is practically the dream ring for this build. It brings 3 rolls for flat damage, one of them being physical, then the other 2 elemental. Then it shores up some of my resistance and attributes gaps. If you don't have access to a ring like this, really you're looking for any ring that shores up those resistance attribute gaps and also brings at least physical damage to attacks, if not an additional elemental modifier for damage to attacks. Alternatively, for this ring slot, you can run Venopuncture, which brings strength, flat physical damage, and magnitude to bleeding up to 30%. For the second ring, we are running an unset for the additional gem slot, but again, same thing, attributes, resistances to fill the gaps, and then a flat physical damage roll, plus if you can find it, an elemental roll. For your amulet, you really are trying to shore up any remaining gaps that you have in attributes and resistances. You also need to bring the spirit on your amulet if you're running the Grand Regalia. Another very nice modifier to look for on your amulet is increased critical damage bonus to help with that twice critical hit from Tangled Tongue. We are anointing with offensive stance. This is providing 1% increased damage per 1% chance to block. Again, making block chance very important for the build. For flasks and charms, it's really user preference. Bring what you want, swap what you want. However, I've got the Staunching Charm in for the Venopuncture. Should we swap that out? You'll want the Staunching Charm in when you are running Venopuncture due to the all damage taken from hits while bleeding contributes to magnitude of chill on you. Then for runes, you can see we've got the Soul Core of Takaba in the Tangled Tongue. Very nice to add to critical damage bonus. Alternatively, you can put in the physical damage rune here. We went over boots for the movement speed and Rune of Cruelty in our gloves. Everything else, you're trying to get as much life in your rune slots as possible. This is dependent on your gaps with resistances and attributes. You shore those up, and then as you scale and get better gear, you start to remove those in favor of maximum life. In my inventory, I've got a couple spears here where if you don't yet have enough critical hit chance or bonus or a really good roll on Tangled Tongue and you don't have Tangled Tongue online, this is the spear that carried me from the beginning of this journey to practically the end, looking for high roll on physical damage basically, and then critical hit chance is also really beneficial. Then towards the end of League, this is another spear that I picked up. Sea Glass is a very good base for the build because it brings in more critical hit chance. And in this case, we've got the plus level to all melee skills. You could go projectile as well. But even this spear with 11.61 on the critical hit chance and the high physical damage is not comparing to what we're getting out of Tangle Tongue once you have that 100% twice critical hit chance on your Blood Hunt and your critical hit damage bonus above 500%. Regarding shields, attribute requirements for spears are really tight across dexterity, strength, and intel due to the skills and the gear that we're wearing. If you're running into attribute requirements, an alternative to the Tower Shield, which has very high strength requirements, is the Targe, which is the split between armor and evasion and has a lot less requirement for strength. This can help you avoid any issues with attributes and help you get those runes moved into maximum life. The drawback here is that you're likely not going to be able to hit that 50% cap on your armor if you go that direction. So eventually I would try to move into tower shields if you can. Regarding cost, you can get into this build pretty cheaply because these uniques are not expensive. However, you're not going to be able to just jump right into T4 pinnacle bosses on the cheap. You are going to need to invest and scale this over time. Now, for actually getting to the point where you're at T4 pinnacle bosses, I wasn't doing that until I had invested about 100 div or so into this character. Before we move on to skills and then the passive tree, I do want to bring up this ascendancy point stay light use cover, as it is a very key component of the build and of our gear that we just went over. This is what is capping us at 50% on armor and evasion. And then we've got some benefits here. Enemies have an accuracy penalty against you based on distance. Now there's been some testing out there and it doesn't seem like that's a very strong point here. However, the top line, defend with 200% of armor. This is actually a big deal, especially due to the fact that we are splitting between armor and evasion, which makes it hard for us to bring either up to very high levels. What this does is it essentially doubles our armor, and although we have this 50% cap, that damage reduction is variable based on the size of the hit due to the way armor scales. So in effect, we are hitting this reduction cap a lot further along that damage scale than we normally would. This allows us to tank bigger hits than we normally would be able to with the amount of armor that we have. And then with the resistance profile, you can see we are able to bring a lot of chaos resistance in with the warriors armor piece that we have. And then we're trying to overcap with all of our elemental resistances. In this case, I'm a bit light on fire. Overall, at 50% on both armor and evasion, and then max block chance with 2300 health and 363 shield, I feel pretty tanky out there, able to cruise through T15, 16 Delirium maps. And in this case, I took a massive slam from a T4 Arbiter and actually survived. So don't let these numbers mislead you into thinking that this is a glass cannon. This is not a glass cannon build. Then for the support gems, we're going to go somewhat rapid fire here. There is a mobilytics associated with this build that is linked in the video description. You can follow that if you really need to follow along. But I'll highlight any interactions that are important. So we've got Rake. The big thing about Rake is that it brings 100% increased magnitude on your bleeding, 100% chance to bleed, and the damage increases based on the distance traveled. It even gets buffed with quality up to 30% more damage based on distance traveled. Then we run Deep Cuts for more bleed magnitude, Execute to play with our Deepest Tower Spirit Bone Crown, which again considers every monster around us to be on low life, and then 50% more damage with hits against enemies that are on low life. Momentum, since we are traveling with this skill, 40% more damage. Overextend, the daze really doesn't affect you here, and then you get 30% more critical damage bonus, which is really nice for the Tangle Tongues, and concentrated effect. Blood Hunt is the follow-up skill to Rake, where you consume the blood and get that blood explosion. We use Inevitable Critical to help us ensure that we we get to that 100% twice critical hit chance, which is extremely important. You always want a twice critical hit with Blood Hunt. Close combat, 25% more damage. Heft, we'll see in the passive tree, we do have a lucky passive, which will help us with Heft, giving us another twice roll on a regular hit, which means more maximum physical hit damage. Bloodlust, 30% more melee physical damage. Impale, this is the big support gem here for us on this build, and honestly I would almost call this an Impale build because we're getting a twice critical hit with Blood Hunt and we're consuming that bleed for even more damage. Blood Hunt is doing an extreme amount of damage. However, we are storing 30% of that damage for the next hit that we make. That next hit is going to be a follow-up Rake. That second Rake after Blood Hunt is what is killing T4 Xesht. You see at the end of that, the bleed is just insane, and that is due to Impale. Then we've got Lightning Spear. This is our bread and butter in the maps. I mean, we're just throwing this thing into the enemy's face, and again, we're pinning and electrocuting everything, shocking everything. We've got Herald of Thunder following up. Super strong skill. We support it with Vault, which is very standard, Perpetual Charge to, again, just make sure that we're using Frenzy Charges. Frenzy Charges bring a ton of damage to this skill. You want to have it empowered at all times with Frenzy Charges. Deliberation, 20% more damage. I find that the 30% movement speed penalty is not that big a deal. However, this is a bit of user preference, and you can see I don't actually run Martial Tempo on my Lightning Spear. You may want to swap this out for Martial Tempo if you really enjoy a faster throw and not having a speed penalty. 25% more elemental damage with Primal Armament. And then Fork. Fork is what really spreads the lightning out across the screen, and you get a lot more off-screen kills by using Fork. Bloodhound's Mark. So this was super powerful early on and during the scaling process. However, towards the end, once you've really scaled this build, you're gonna find that this really isn't necessary to kill most bosses that you come across. You're not getting a stun on a T4 boss. However, for the T4s, you are breaking the armor very fast, which does help with that bleed magnitude and with your Blood Hunt. So overall, still useful. However, if you wanted to get rid of the unset ring and put in a breach ring, this is the skill that I would get rid of. Inspiration, this skill is very costly. Single out, armor broken, this is how you break the armor and it happens very fast. Break posture for days. Physical mastery. Rupture helps to ensure that we're aggravating bleeding on bosses without having to disengage. Spearfield, another skill that was super useful early on, still useful today, and mainly that's to just build up the rage. So you lay this down and get your rage as needed. It does help with that bleed magnitude and then the Blood Hunt. The skill also does help during mapping if you need to lay it down to get maim off across the waves that are coming at you. It helps you create some distance between some dangerous packs. We support with rearm, rage, pin for added pin and frenzy charge buildup, martial tempo because the skill is extremely slow, and then lacerate because we don't bring a whole lot of chance to bleeding in this build outside of Rake, which has a 100% chance to cause bleeding. Our mobility option is disengage, and we support with blind, unyielding, shocking leap, culmination, and ingenuity. Ingenuity is the real important one here because it allows you to spam disengage. If you don't have ingenuity, you're going to run into cooldown issues when you need it. Then for the spirit gems, starting off with Wind Dancer, this allows us to hit that 50% cap on our evasion that we need. We support with maim, life thief, unabating, and unbreakable. Then we've got Herald of Thunder to back up our Lightning Spear. We support this to ensure that we're getting Electrocute to, again, build up the Frenzy charges. We have Deadly Herald for 30% more damage. Neural Overload, which electrocutes primed enemies, which means we're getting Electrocute out sooner than we normally would. Long Shot for more damage. Lightning Infusion for more lightning damage. And then Electrocute. Combat Frenzy is how we're generating the Frenzy charges. We went over this, and we have a Perfusion for a 50% chance to grant an additional charge. Then War Banner, another one that was really useful early on to try to push that damage, get a big damage boost. And it's still beneficial because it is a massive boost at 50 charges for your Rake and your Blood Hunt. I lay this down on bosses that I really want to kill fast, and that's about every boss I come across. And then also when you're mapping, sometimes it's nice to lay this down if you got a few rares because it almost ensures that the Lightning Spear will just wipe the screen. We support with persistence and magnified effect. Now for the passive tree. So we are the mercenary right next door to the Amazon, giving us very easy access to all of the spear things, which is very nice for this build. Means we don't have to travel a whole lot. So in the mercenary tree, we do pick up some of the armor and evasion nodes, battle hardened, feel no pain, and backup plan. This really helps us defensively, and it's easy to pick up. Then this is where we pick up Lay Siege for that increased damage per 1% chance to block. And again, we are anointing offensive stance, which is an additional 1% increased damage per 1% block. And through our gear and our passives, we have reached the 75% block threshold without using glancing blows, which would mean we would take 50% of the damage from blocked hits. Instead, we're taking 10% of the damage from blocked hits with glancing hits. And we've got the low life wheel here, which again plays into our helm, deepest tower, spirit bone, crown. Enemies are considered to be on low life when they're in your presence, and we're dealing more damage to enemies that are on low life based on this wheel. 30%, 30%, 30% increased damage with hits against enemies that are on low life. That's on top of the 50% that we have due to execute on our Rake. And then damage with hits are lucky against enemies that are on low life with stars aligned. This plays into that support gem Heft on our Blood Hunt, where again, we're getting 2 rolls and we have a higher maximum. We get lucky with more maximum physical hit damage more often. Then finishing blows, 60% increased damage with hits against enemies that are on low life, 30% increased stun build up against enemies that are on low life. Very strong wheel here. Now, because we chose to move right into the Amazon side of the wheel, we are missing out on another low life wheel here. I played around a lot in Path of Building and testing and found that it just made more sense to move this direction with the build rather than go into the warrior area for finality, which would have been another 120% increased damage here against enemies that are on low life, but it just wasn't enough to bring us over to this side of the passive tree. Instead, we travel out this direction to ensure we get enhanced reflexes that was really crucial for getting us to the 50% cap on evasion. And while we're out here, we're able to pick up some very strong critical nodes in these 2 wheels. For the rest of the main passive tree, we're picking up a bunch of crit. With these nodes, we've got Cooked, Dispatch Foes, and Tainted Strike. And then we're picking up the Block Chance with Shield Expertise, Glancing Hits. We're picking up Movement Speed and Skill Speed with Acceleration. And then our From Nothing diamond here is Zealot's Oath, which gives us 75% increased attack damage. And then we're running a Megalomaniac diamond, which allocates projectile bulwark and tempered mind. So 30% increased armor and defend with 120% armor against projectile attacks. And then tempered mind, 20% increased critical damage bonus, 10 strength, and 20% increased physical damage. Very strong. However, it's hard to match 1-for-1 on these jewels. Pick up what makes sense for you and what's affordable, what you have access to. For any rare jewels, I focused on Magnitude of Bleeding and Block Chance. This one in particular has a max roll on Magnitude Bleeding and brings 2 rage when hit by an enemy, very strong, and then increased life regen rate. Alternatively, you could focus on your crit damage bonus for your jewels, which is another strong option. Then we get into the weapon set points. Our weapon set number 1 is Lightning Spear, and for this we're picking up Thunderstruck, which includes increased lightning damage along the way, and then increased electrocute build up to ensure that we're getting the electrocute out more often. And same thing for electrocution over here. More electrocute, more frenzy charges equals more damage. And lastly, Coming Calamity gives us 50% increased lightning damage while affected by Herald of Thunder. For remaining points, fill out critical nodes as you see fit. Then also you can, in this case, Feel No Pain is actually on my Lightning Spear weapon set because it's what I'm using using most often in maps and would need more armor and evasion, whereas on the Rake side, which we'll get into, we really need all of our points in magnitude. And then for weapon set 2, it's all about Rake and Bleed magnitude. So we cut in here for wasting, fast acting toxins, and deterioration. Then for the final point at 95 for me, I'll be in perfectly placed knife, 30% increased critical hit chance against bleeding enemies, which will really help with follow-up rakes, ensuring that we get more twice critical hit out since Rake is not capped at the 100%. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It helps me grow the channel. I am working on another build behind this one. It's going to be completely different. I decided to drop Bleed this time around, so I'm very excited about this character. We'll see how it goes. I'm kind of cooking still, but let's keep it going. Till next time, take care.